Afternoon to the House Appropriations Committee. It is Tuesday, April 8th, 2025. It's just after 3:10 p.m. and we have come back to vote on H 454, and then we'll have Emily Byrne come and talk to us about some federal funds stuff. And then we'll have Sarah Clark and Adam Gresham in about more federal fund stuff. Before we take our vote, I just wanted to mention that I misspoke when I said that 200,000 was going to go to the State Board of Education. That's how we had it, the request that was we were looking at in our budget. But in fact, in this bill, it goes to the Agency of Education for the State Board of Ed. So it's a little roundabout way, but that it's actually being appropriated to the Agency of Education. So I just want to clarify that since I didn't say it correctly when we were on live before. But the numbers are still the same and the purpose is still the same. All right. So I would entertain a motion to pass out H 454 favorably. Is there a motion to do so? So moved by Tiff.
Draft 4.1.
As passed out of.
As amended by House Education, further amended by House Weight.
Oh, thank you. That's why we have a clerk.
That's what he's talking.
Yes. All right. Is there any further discussion at this point? We don't need a second, but you're welcome to second for form's sake.
We don't need it. I'll say.
All right. So hearing no further discussion at this point, why doesn't the clerk call the roll, please?
Representative Lindley?
Yes.
Representative Dickinson?
No.
May I also make a note here. Lynn, this will be your second of 3 times to do remote voting. You understand that?
I understand that. I don't intend to be remote.
We have to mark it now, so thank you, Trevor.
Representative Harrison?
No.
Representative Konsenska?
No, I have some unanswered questions just from the language here as well, which I'll address outside of here. So for right now.
Representative Roche?
I have a lot, but it's not.
Representative Rowicki?
Yes.
Representative Nigro?
Yes.
Representative Squirrel, yes. Representative Stevens?
Yes.
Representative Jacoboni?
Yes.
Representative Shy?
Yes.
Vote is 7-4.
Okay, great, thank you. And Mike Maricki has the education. I guess it couldn't be either, Mike, couldn't it? But I think it's actually education thing. I think it's really.
It feels like education to me.
Well, because it is where the appropriations are. It's not a tax appropriation, or it would be. It's not smoothly done. It's Mike Maricki, and it's not tips. Let the record show. You've got 2 things.
Right.
It'll be very quick. All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Trevor. Mike, Trevor will send the thing to Nigel and you'll get your thing to send back. They know that this is coming. So thank you all. We're done with that for now, and we're going to segue into federal funds. And Emily, who had at least a moment to take a breath. Thank you, guys.
All right. I have a Zoom, right, Aaron? All right, so for the record, Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office. Here just to talk a little bit about federal funds. Some of these slides you saw before, although between when you saw them the first time and now you did pass the budget and the budget adjustment again. So, a lot's happened, but so generally, so the chair and in conversations with us, we have with the Joint Fiscal Office, we've sort of talked about there's a lot going on at the federal level. A lot of things are changing every day, and just to the extent you have a little bit of downtime between now and when the Senate finishes their work on the budget and then come back to reconcile the 2 things, that it might be a good idea to spend some time sort of thinking about federal funds. They represent about $3 billion of the appropriations that the state makes. And just looking, spend some time talking to departments, talking to the agency administration about where federal funds are used in state government, how they're used, not necessarily to think about the doomsday scenario, if you will, of a lot of them going away, but just to sort of get a better understanding of what the baseline is. In case there are changes at the federal level in terms of what funds are coming to state government, to the extent you have a better baseline understanding of sort of where they're going, what they're used for, you can react accordingly. I think that, the challenge will be if there are changes, the timing that they come in and sort of what programs are impacted and how do those programs kind of fit into the other priorities in state government. And, there'll be a lot to think about, but sort of getting that baseline of like where they are, how they work, how state government is funded with them and who the subrecipients are, who the people that are receiving these funds is just like an important thing to understand. And if, if nothing happens, it is just a good thing to understand in terms of like how state government works and where money is moving and what government is providing for people on behalf of the feds. So
It'll make us smarter.
yes. So this is just sort of like a general thing about the, federal funds where you recall, I didn't update it for FY26 since that's still in flight, but the FY25 as passed budget was about a third federal funds and about 2/3 so state funds, right? And that's everything from the general fund to the ed fund to special funds, trust funds, et cetera. And then this chart, this is the state versus federal funds by sort of area of government, if you will. So you can see in Medicaid, that's where we get the biggest chunk of federal funds. It's a little bit over, they pay for over 50% of the Medicaid program in Vermont. And yeah, you can also see that and transportation is another one. It's like, there's both when you like looking at this chart, it's supposed to sort of think about it in two ways, right? Both sort of the size of the bars, right? So that kind of gives you the total dollars, but also in the sort of percentage of the program, right? So like, yes.
Go ahead.
So if I'm reading this chart, it's approximately $1.5 billion in Medicaid.
Yes.
And how much is it in education?
Education, that's a good one. It's about 350 million. So in the education,
The Agency of Education.
mostly at the agency and like the Title I grant, the title
There's
grants.
grants that go straight through the
Correct.
school. So what's the total in education, do you know?
Federal funds, 354 million in the FY25.
And then the other big one was transportation. How much is that?
Yeah. It's better. It's easier to look at it on this chart. The
53.
almost 500 million. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So in the this column, the sort of federal share, that gives you a little bit more. I did change that number, but the one that's a little tricky is the education one, because if you look at like all of the education money, it includes the ed payment, right? But I try to note that, right? If we take the ed payment and teachers' retirement out of it, there's about $400 million going to education, sort of state funds, general funds, and federal funds. And then of that, about 88% of it is federal funds. The other places where there's a lot of federal money, the Department of Labor has a lot of federal funds for the UI program. Certain areas in the protection area have a lot of federal funds. And housing has a bunch of federal funds in it. So there's federal funds kind of everywhere. And the presentation that I gave back in February, we can resend that around. That dives into a little bit more detail by department in terms of what the breakdown of federal funds are.
So, Emily, there is nothing here. Tom just made a point. I don't see agriculture.
They are in the way and so this is organized by the budget, right? And agriculture is considered a protection.
Under protection.
It's under protection because it's a regulatory function. So the agriculture, I don't have the agriculture detail in front of me. That's going to be on the in the presentation I gave before, but we'll send that back around in terms of, but ag is another, it's a lot of federal funds.
A lot of grants, some loans, and very little staffing to the state, but still, it's just a lot of
Mhm.
money for farms.
There's one of the bars that says protection.
Yes. Protection, yeah. So that's the section of the state budget that includes everything. So that's
It's the B200 section.
B200. It's
200 section.
It's a big umbrella and includes everything like the judiciary and the attorneys and the defender general, the state police, And then like regulatory functions. So the Department of Financial Regulation is sort of considered a protection function. The Secretary of State's off, them.
Utilities.
The Public Utilities Commission.
Any of your 200 numbers in your budget portfolio will show up here.
Yeah.
So does cannabis. Tom?
Thank you.
And maybe I'm jumping the gun to a larger conversation, but you had listed off at the very beginning, your preface just sort of saying, all right, so let's say any of this gets cut. You know, one of the things that I keep harping on, like that I don't see or that I don't know about is scenario planning. Each of these has a bunch of dominoes underneath these dominoes, right? So if one of these goes, if Medicaid, for instance, says, oops, 500 million is gone. Or at least JFO, and I'll have the same question for the administration, are we doing the scenario planning of what is it going to take? It's not going to be just 400 or $500 million that we have to know what silos that money's going for. We have to know that, will this affect hospitals? Will this affect doctors? Will this affect, you know, that community? Same with the education. So I'm just curious, like how deep are you able to get to
Yeah.
in the thinking of how are we going to react?
Yeah. And so we haven't done really any scenario planning at this point, I think, because the like pieces that are challenging, and we've done a lot of thinking and talking about scenario planning. But I think what's really challenging about trying to do a scenario planning when you have no idea what the lever that's going to be pulled is, right? Like, is we don't know if it's going to be a change in the match rate or a change in the eligibility or a change in the, you know, what that will look like and what that looks like is going to drive the decisions that you make, right?
Right. I just think the art of scenario planning is practice.
Mhm.
And it sounds like your brains are keeping you up at night anyway, thinking about what those are going to be. Because that's right. You're absolutely right. You're never going to know until you're never going to know if there's a Spanish Inquisition, you know, and
COVID.
or COVID or, you know, something. And so I appreciate that, you know, not that you're up all night thinking about it, but I am. And I just want to make sure that we hit the ground with the idea of, instead of being surprised, that we're at least prepared with sharpened pencils.
And I think that's sort of part of what this exercise is, right? Is to get all of you thinking about, right? Like where, you know, where it comes, when it comes, sort of what are the things that like we really can't, as government, we really shouldn't stop doing if the federal government walks away, and what are the things that we would scale back, and what are the things that, you know, we would do differently if we're, you know, not do it at all anymore, depending on what happens, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So and these are sort of Emily's random thoughts on federal funds that I thought would just be sort of good table setting before starting to hear from agencies and departments and other entities. But so a lot of times when we talk about federal funding, there's match requirements, right? And so that's sort of built into the state budget currently. Depending on the type of federal grant will impact, you know, what the match is. And I think, meant to say this at the beginning, but I think if you've seen one federal grant, you have seen one federal grant, right? They all have different rules and match rates and all that kind of thing. You know, some of them are older, they're younger, they're all different. This is my silly, prop, if you will. These are two books I brought with me that I have carried with me since being at the Agency of Education, but this is the Administrator's Handbook on what's called the EDGAR, which is the updated Education Department's General Administrative Regulations. And it includes both how you implement federal funds for, you know, based on 2 CFR 200, which is the uniform guidance, and then what, you know, the Department of Education says you have to do. And it's like not a short, like this is a lot of very fine print and these are all the things I flagged. And then I was there when issued up, like, this is version number 4 and it's significantly larger, and looking at like, yeah, so this is, you know, like implementing federal funds is complicated. This is my favorite note that I found that I wrote when I worked at AOE that says, if it walks and talks like a sub-grant, even if we call it even if we call it a contract. That was an important thing for me. But anyway, it's complicated. There's a lot to it, and it depends, like every federal fund has a different this is sort of applies to all the US Department of Ed money, but every funding stream sort of has its own set of rules, along with the sort of general rules that apply to how you implement it. And right, to the extent, right, like we have a small f federal system, right? The federal government has said we want to accomplish this thing, but we're going to leave the bureaucracy at the states. We'll let the states do it on our behalf, and we will audit them and monitor them to make sure they're doing the thing that we asked them to do within the rules that we have set up. But that some grants have more flexibility in terms of what the state is allowed to do with the money versus others where it's very prescriptive in terms of this is how you're going to implement it. So to that end, some of them have match requirements, right? And the federal government says, we kick in $1, you kick in 50 cents, and then we'll call it a deal. And that's just, an important thing to think about because that match is sort of embedded within the state budget. And thinking through if there are changes to those federal funds, what does that mean for the availability of match? And the one you hear a lot about is the FMAP, the federal Medicaid assistance percentage. A lot of federal grants have, what we talk about is maintenance of effort. So meaning the extent state government was providing that service prior to the federal government providing, you have to continue to provide that service and continue to provide the same level of service using your state funds going forward. It's also sometimes it's talked about as a sort of supplement versus supplant, right? You can't use the federal dollars to supplant state dollars that are providing the same thing. The federal dollars are used to sort of supplement the programs that the state is providing. The single audit, colleagues from the administration have come in. I know they're going to speak more to the single audit and the CFA, but the single audit is the sort of review that the state has to go through of how it spent its federal dollars to make sure it's in compliance with like these types of rules. A lot of times federal fundings have small state minimums or per capita allocations. In Vermont, we talk a lot about small state minimums and the sort of benefit associated with getting a small state minimum. In many cases, if the federal grant was calculated on the per capita basis that is used to help to give funds to states like New York and California, Vermont would not have enough money to operate the programs. So I can't remember. It depends, again, it depends on the grant. It depends on sort of how it was set up, but that some of the smaller states, Vermont, Wyoming, South Dakota, get sort of a minimum amount of funds to operate the programs. Those small state minimums, though, depending on the program, depending on sort of what's going on, the minimum hasn't necessarily changed in a long time. So in some instances, you have a small state minimum that's been the same for years, for decades, and sort of we're operating, right? It's doing more with the same nowadays. Rules on administrative use of the funds. So I sort of talked about there's lots of rules on how whether or not you can buy food or how you, what like the rules around travel are, and there are just lots of administrative rules. But we've talked about with internal service funds that the federal government sort of recognizes that there's administrative costs to operating programs on their behalf. And there are positions often funded, and those, we've also have all these sort of cost allocation plans across state government that operate differently that allow state government to sort of draw on those federal grants to use federal funds to do the sort of base operating of state government. And we talk about that a lot when we talk about these sort of internal service funds and how federal funds are used for the internal service programs. And sort of it's a way to make sure that the federal government pays its share of things like fee for space or human resources or finance management. And similar, like just as, like to keep in the back of your head, right, federal grants, they're really contracts with the states, right? They comes with terms and conditions, and we have to sort of follow those terms and conditions and allow the state and federal government to sort of, and they get negotiated, right? Thinking about just like different types of federal funding. So there's, categorical grants. The categorical grants are more of the like, hey, states, do a thing and we'll pay our share of it. So some examples, right? Like the WIC program or the Title I funding that goes to schools for low income kids. There's also block grants where that's where the federal government says, hey, do a thing and here's a pile of money and go do it, right? Block grants tend to have a little bit more flexibility generally than the sort of categorical grants. An example of this is TANF for the CBDG grant at ACCD. There are also competitive grants, which in my head is more of the federal government says like, hey, we've got a pile of money and we want someone to do a thing. Anybody want it? And then states or municipalities or nonprofits, whoever can go and apply for those funds and then do a thing for a certain period of time. One that I pulled off of the JFC list recently was we got some money to do LiDAR mapping. It was a one-off kind of thing. It's not like that sort of continuous thing. And formula grant and categorical and formula grants overlap. Sometimes the categorical grants are, allocated by formula. But, Medicaid is sort of the big thing that we think about when we think about formula grants. And that as long as we're, doing the thing that qualifies, we get the money to reimburse us. There's no I shouldn't say that. There may be we can't just spend forever, but there is a
Sort of
we
ongoing.
will reimburse as long as we incur the costs. So in thinking about reviewing federal funds and some of the conversations that you're going to have, right? Thinking about, if there's a state match that's required, or is there a maintenance of effort that's required, that if there has to be a change related to a federal program, sort of how does that impact whether or not, if a federal program goes away and there's state match associated with it, we still have the state match that could be redeployed elsewhere. Thinking about, are there positions funded with the dollars that are implementing those programs, and how those positions sort of are doing federal programs versus other things. Learning about who the sort of beneficiaries and subrecipients are. Right, sometimes a subrecipient could be a nonprofit or a hospital or whoever, and then beneficiaries is more thinking about what individuals are receiving WIC benefits or Medicaid benefits. And this one I just put in there because sometimes it's actually another state entity that's a subrecipient of federal funds from an agency or a department. So an example might be the Department of Public Safety gets a grant from Homeland Security, and one of the things they want done is, they give money to the judiciary to put some additional security at the courts, right? So the federal government has one partner that they're working with when they give the grant to the state. But then within state government, because we're all states are organized differently, the disbursement of those funds among the state may different. And a lot of times you'll see that in the interdepartmental transfer line. So there sometimes are federal funds embedded in an agency within the interdepartmental transfer line. So it's, understanding both what are they taking in, but then also if they're receiving funds from other entities within state government. Understanding if the funding is an entitlement. So whether or not if somebody qualifies, do they get the funds no matter what? So these are just, again, some random Emily things that we've thought about at JFO and then I've thought about related to federal funds. And just a couple of resources. This slide I know we've looked at before, but FFIS provides a lot of good information. They're providing a lot of updates based on what's currently going on in Washington. They have this federal funds per capita summary for all of the states, and this is a good bit of information about sort of how much federal funding is coming into Vermont. And JFO has put together a website or a page on our website. So if you go to the subjects on our website and then under other subjects, it says federal funds under the Trump administration, and then it provides, it has, by those function areas that we talked about that the budget is organized under, to the extent we're getting information, we're posting it on the website, and it's not meant to be a repository for newspaper articles. It's really when there are official documents either produced by entities within state government or by the federal government about the state of federal funds that are being posted there. That's all I have at this point. I don't know if you have any questions for me.
And this was on our website, and it's very helpful. Thank you for helping us think about how to think about it, which is, we haven't really had to, we were chatting earlier, and, most of the time that most of us have been at state government, we're saying, oh yeah, there's federal funds, great. Now we don't have to worry. And that is not the way we need to be thinking right now. So, because we haven't had to think about it, now we do, and it's really helpful to have a sense of how we should. So, thank you, Emily, and I assume you're going to be sticking around for
Yes.
next presentation. So Secretary Clark and Commissioner Gresham would like to come table. We appreciate it. And did we get copies, Erin? Erin has made some copies for us.
Oh, wow.
I only had her pictures. We just did the one on to set up by state agency. I didn't do the other one.
Yeah, that's the best look to have.
That's the most sense.
I use my computer. That's helpful. Thank you, Erin.
I know you've all been missing spreadsheets. I know it's been a week or two, so it's good for us to have a spreadsheet again.
This was nice. True.
Jeez.
Ready for us to?
Yes.
It's been great.
Just introduce yourselves and take it away, please.
I'm Sarah Clark. I'm the Secretary of Administration.
Adam Gresham, Commissioner of Finance and Management.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me back this week. I think we're going to maybe accomplish two things while we're here today. One, Commissioner Gresham is going to talk about what data is available right now for you, which Erin just kindly handed out as it relates to the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, or the CFA. So Adam will talk a little bit about that. And then I thought it might be helpful. I was here, I think, in mid-February, talking about how the administration is approaching the kind of monitoring and assessment of federal action. And I thought we could talk a little bit about where we are from where we were, gosh, almost 2 months ago that I was here, which is a slightly terrifying timeline. It's gone by in a blink. So, Commissioner
And
Gresham.
then we'll use this as the basis for what we're getting from the other agencies, so.
Right. So, thank you, Madam Secretary. So what you have in front of you is affectionately called the CFA, the Schedule of Expenditures for Federal Awards. And just, for a little lighthearted banter ahead of that, if you guys remember, I sat in this very chair a month or so ago on bended knee. Actually, I was on bended knee. I wasn't sitting in the chair, defending my department's budget. And I said that, part of our finance and management team, kind of the outward facing folks, we're here defending the budget, advocating. But the bigger part of the department is actually financial operations, FinOps, and they're more internally focused and kind of hidden away doing a lot of the reporting that's not only required to make sure we're staying within budget parameters that you guys set, but also putting out the required federal and state reports. So one of the things that they do, and this is under John Becker's group, is the ACFR, which is at the end of the year, by December 31st every year, is issued. And a number of other reports they do, but the other main report is the CFA, which is due March 31st of the 9 months, basically, from the end of the fiscal year. So the fiscal year ends June 30th. 9 months from then is March 31st. So by law, by federal law, it needs to be issued by then. So typically the end of March, I signed this, I think it was 2 weeks ago. Typically we have it ready by the end of March. To do this report, departments and agencies go to our website, and which you can do too, and under finance and management, and you click on reports and forms, actually you click on, and there's a whole bunch of forms. This is part of what we call the Act for 9. So I call it the 9th form that we ask people to fill out to make sure that we can get our Act for out in time. And that is, the Act for 9 is the CFA report or CFA form. And this is submitted, the information in this report is submitted by departments and agencies to financial operations early September, believe it or not. And that's because by early September, the outside auditor that we hire in this year's CLA needs to take this information, look at it, put it through the paces, make sure it's accurate. They do a number of just spot checks. They take a line or two and follow it up. So in total, though, they spend a number of months on it, and then they get back to departments and agencies to check and to ask for corrections. Inevitably, there are corrections they ask for. So the process takes about 9 months. So it's very time consuming, but the beauty of it is once it's out, we can feel with 99% certainty that the information is correct. And this information is part of the Single Audit Act, which is a congressional act, a federal act that requires recipients of federal awards above a certain threshold. And I want to say the threshold is, I think it's less than $1 million. I want to say it's like $750,000. So it's not just states, but municipalities, I guess, nonprofits, they all have to submit this, what they call CIPA, which is part of the Single Audit Act. So that's why we do this. But having, kind of said that in context, admittedly, it's very good to be able to pull this out of our back pocket when we're asked the question, all right, what kind of federal money do you have? So this is really our best go-to sheet. And you can, and I think we're sharing the Excel sheet too. So this can be sliced and diced in any number of different ways. We've sliced it by, as you see here, agency. You can also slice it by the ALN number, which is assisted listing number, which is the latter-day CFDA. That's how they track the grants, both federally and in the state. You can probably also sort it by federal agency. So in other words, anyway, you could also, actually what I did, the first thing I sorted it by size of expenditure, because I was curious. Part of the question is, all right, what do we have at risk? Probably the best way to see is sort from largest to smallest. And guess what? Medicaid's our largest, and second on the list would be our transportation, federal highway aid. So anyway, so this is sliceable and diceable. But what we have here are, we sorted it by agency. You see the agency within state government, the ALN number, which is how the grant is categorized, and then what the name of it is, what federal agency it came from, and whether it's a direct award or indirect. There are some non-monetary, which are, I would say in kind. We also have a category that will go away at some point, probably in 2 years, actually, which is COVID or not COVID. And then importantly, the two columns on the right are expenditures and amount passed through to subrecipients. The expenditures is exactly that. It's what we spent. It is not what we budgeted. And, for the vast majority of these grants, what we budget and what we expend are pretty damn similar. Most of these grants go, for example, directly to the Department of Health. They've got a very specific purpose, and that grant funds X number of positions or, subcontracts or whatever it does. But, it's the cost of administering the program for a year. So we typically spend approximately what we receive. A good example of the contrary would be, think about ARPA. In ARPA, over, I think, the course of, we may receive 2 or 3 different checks. We received over $1 billion. And, that clearly we haven't spent all. So there'll be a very large discrepancy between what we receive and what you see on this expenditure report. Over time, the two should equal. But so this reports on expenditures. And like I said, typically they're similar, but they're oftentimes not exactly right.
We're missing that column that's the amount of the original grant, basically.
Yeah,
Right.
this shows you what we spent.
Right. So, but we don't know if, the dairy business innovation for 11.2 million was really 20 million and they only have spent 11. what's kind of a piece we're missing,
Typically, and I'm here to tell you that generally it's similar, but not always.
except when it isn't.
When it is.
When it's an annual allotment, so let's say it's reoccurred every year for the last however many years, right? So, which we have a lot of programs that operate in that manner.
But we
Yeah.
wouldn't know that as from this piece of paper.
Correct.
And so if I were to just go through again, that dairy innovation one, just because I had highlighted it. So they have expenditures of 11.2 million, and then they passed 9.2 million to sub-recipients. Does that mean that they kept the other 2 million? Or it just hasn't been spent yet?
It could be for payroll, it could be for payroll, it could be for operating expenses. I mean,
Or it could be unspent so far?
No, these are actually expenditures. So that's, I think, what's helpful about the SEFA. It reflects what was actually spent in state fiscal year 24. So the way, and because I've had some conversations in this arena as it relates to subrecipient payments. So I would say the delta between, in this case, the 11.2 and the 9.2 is probably what they spent on their internal operations, either staff or operating expenses. It could include contractual payments because that's different than a subrecipient payment.
Right, and we can't tell from here who the subrecipients are. They're just somebody, organizations, right, Jim?
Okay, so we don't add these together.
no.
Correct.
Okay. How do we know which of these, I mean, there are some obviously that are part of your budget that's presented to us. I mean, a lot of departments have federal funding categories. But we also, throughout the year, we get, from fiscal committee, we get notifications that you've signed off on that requesting approval that aren't part of the budget, and they are, like, I got them set for specific purposes. And it might fund a couple positions for a temporary period while that grant is going on, that they were awarded and get approved. But those don't typically, they're sort of outside the budget cycle.
So that's why sometimes looking at what's budgeted is not particularly tight information, because that's precisely right. What would happen is we get a grant mid-year. You guys approve it, I write an excess or sign an excess receipt, and that money is off to the races. That would show up here on expenditure.
Well, because this is
If it was, that's right. Well, if it were expended, it would show up here. If they didn't expend it yet, it wouldn't. But if it were expended, it'd show up here, but it wouldn't show up in the budget of that year because they didn't have it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyway, that's how that would work.
Wayne?
Back on the non-monetary, can you explain how that works? What's non-monetary?
I would probably best refer to that as in kind.
So I might use the word in kind to say say we were getting a grant and we had a match of $20,000 in kind. I did $20,000 worth of work and get the money from the feds. Would be in kind. So I see like 107 million there. That's not happening like that.
Or it could be food, for example, for a summer EBT program, maybe they deliver, a crate of bananas. I don't know. I mean, it could be any number of things, but
So the feds could provide 107 million. Agriculture could provide that much in goods.
that's right. Or equipment with public safety, stuff like that. But that's typically what I think. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I suspect, there's some grants that require some in-kind
Yes.
contribution toward, if you're going to receive monies to do very specific functions.
And I think that's one of the items that Emily had on her slide for consideration, and one that we've been discussing, as you drill in, trying to understand our federal expenditures, understanding like what's this, is there a state match requirement? And what is it? There was one. So. And so maybe I can follow up. I think Rep. Harrison had a question about this report doesn't have the list of the subrecipients, and it doesn't, that's not on the SEFA. But there are some other data sources that don't necessarily tie exactly to the SEFA and what were the FY24 expenditures, but it can give you a sense of, for example, who and what organizations make up that subrecipient grouping. And so and we can follow up and provide the links to Aaron on our website. it's called Spotlight for Financial Transparency. And so there is a variety of like really detailed information there to include a by fiscal year listing of grants that were issued in FY '24, for example. That's the most recent year where we have information. And what's helpful about that is that it gives you, you can sort it by federal funds and by ALN, formerly known as the CFDA number. You can sort it in that manner, and then you can see all of the subrecipients that received funds from a federal program. So it can give you a flavor, like if we were talking about the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families TANF program, if there were subrecipients being funded by that, it'll give you a sense of who those organizations are and for information, because I think it is important to understand that. And that's something at Human Services. We do, Adam's team publishes that every year. You can see the grants. There's also a listing of contracts. But at the Agency of Human Services, something that we had a kind of our own separate, very specific request on our grants issuance that when I was the CFO there, we provided to the legislature every year. So it provides some more deeper details in terms of how we are issuing and to whom we are issuing grants. So I think that may be helpful to the committee as well.
Questions people have about this?
So, so it's quite a list. Not sure, I'll find the helpfulness of it eventually, but so in the case of what's going on, so using agriculture as an example, there have been certain agricultural programs that have already been cut or the funds have been frozen or what have you. Are you tracking those on the same thing for fiscal year 25, where we know that if, and I can't say which ALN number is the right number, but let's just say the USDA Food Bank Network, where I know that the food bank has had funds frozen. That is really kind of a substantial amount. Are you tracking those in a different document so that if this were up to the minute accurate, or up to the minute, not accurate, but up to the minute, where a certain amount of funding would be highlighted so that we would be able to see that? Is that in your plan to make sure that, so that at a press of a button on any given week, at the end of any given week, you'll know which funds have been potentially frozen, cut, whatever the phrases are?
Yeah, that's a great segue to what I wanted to talk about next. So thank you, Representative Stevens. And I wish, no, I know, but it's that Waterbury communicado. I wish we could press the button and understand this stuff, but we can't. But I will say, when I was here back in mid-February, I think it was, we talked about what approach we are taking in terms of being sure that we are assessing and monitoring very closely action at the federal level. And I think since I was here 2 months ago, that action has certainly picked up quite a bit, but it's still like from when an announcement is made at the federal level, trying to understand what the real impact of that federal action will have in Vermont still takes time. But we have instituted a process whereby agencies and departments, as they learn of, I'll say, more of a real impact, they are communicating them up to my office for aggregation, manual aggregation. No button is being pushed, but for manual aggregation so that we are monitoring them all in one place. So that not only so that we can understand what's maybe real and maybe not quite real yet, but also kind of across the executive branch with the intended goal of being able to update the legislature, whether it's when you're in full session, as you are right now, or in anticipation of potential summer work through the Joint Fiscal Committee, and some of the language that I think you incorporated into your version of the big bill. So it hasn't yet been an external document, but I think it's in large part, there's not a lot yet that I would say is a firm line in the sand yet. Even though it sometimes feel like it is, it's still not always clear what the real impact is going to be. And so as we are managing the operations of state government, we want to make sure that we, as calmly as possible, assess what we're learning and understanding from our federal partners, so that we'll be able to respond when that time is right. And the reality is, like, when we'll talk about the local foods program funded through the USDA to the Agency of Agriculture, you know, I think we did receive termination notices for those, and it's about, I think, $1.7 million.
Was that a signed contract, or was that money you were hoping you would, it had been agreed to, but not a signed contract?
I think there was a plan for how we were going to use those funds, but I want to just follow up to confirm in terms of the obligation status of those funds, if it was a signed contract or not.
Kind of interesting to know.
Yeah, and I will for sure follow up on that. But I raise that there's, you know, one thing that we've learned of, I think folks, there's been some directives coming from the federal government in the library space in terms of, you know, letting go all of the federal staff or putting them on paid administrative leave, more precise, paid administrative leave, all of the staff of the, I think it's Institute of Library and Museum Sciences. But as of yet, we have no determinations on whether anything's going to change related to the federal funds that we receive. And so that's one that we're tracking, but no action at this point, but we're tracking. And I raise those as kind of two examples, is because as we're hearing things, like some are more concrete than others, but as we look to the future, we're going to have to evaluate everything, you know, across all of state government, but across all of Vermont as well, as we figure out the most appropriate path forward. And so it's important that we are aggregating and understanding the real impact, but making sure we allow ourselves the ability to reflect in a more as broad a scope as we possibly can to figure out the best path through.
Dave,
I'm jumping to different sheets. I lost my place on the first one, but there was a $12 million expenditure for WIC. There was no subrecipient. So I assumed, which I shouldn't, I said, okay, the health department staff themselves are probably handing out those foods, et cetera. They don't subcontract out to a contractor. And maybe that pays a portion of a nurse's staff age in the district health office. But where I was going with it was, I wonder if it's better bang for your buck by subcontracting out with a community-based nonprofit, family center, what have you. Would you get more for your dollars that way? Would they be less costly? Did anybody ever do those kinds of questions, or should we rethink how we do what we do? And I don't even know how those funds are distributed. It could be, but there was nothing in the subrecipient line, so I assume that means somebody got the 12 million in resources out to somebody.
I think it's
Well,
go ahead.
Theoretically, chime in. I think one thing that's important about the CFA and looking at it, so a subrecipient when it comes to federal grants is sort of a very specific thing, right? It means that the state has written a grant agreement with that subrecipient. So like if you look at this is the space that I know, the Agency of Education lines, you'll see that like the FY24 expenditures and then the subrecipient amount is like pretty high because all that money is moving as a grant agreement with the school districts. But when it's a program like WIC or a program like Medicaid, what you're seeing on the CFA, the beneficiary payments to moms on WIC is not a subrecipient relationship with the state. It's a beneficiary payment. So it doesn't show up in the subrecipient column. So I think the $12 million you're speaking to isn't just, it's a combination of both the costs to operate the program by state government, as well as the actual payments going out to
Understood. Yeah.
the individuals. I think that's just an important thing, right? Like the state government isn't spending $1.4 billion on Medicaid. We are sending most of that to the healthcare providers, right? But if you just look at this, it looks like, if you don't like, understanding what that column means.
Which is why we need a little bit more information than this is a great starting point, but that's why we need more information, because are they subrecipients, are they beneficiaries? What was the original amount? That sort of thing, so,
Hopefully that helps.
yeah.
Thanks, Emily. And I think, I understand that the intent is that you're going to be asking agencies and departments to kind of come in and talk a little bit more about their federal programs in addition to the data. And so I think that would be a great time to, to highlight some of the things, as Emily's pointing out, in Medicaid. It's really a lot of money that's going out, payments to support Vermonters who are in the program. I think your questions, Representative Iacoboni, about the WIC program, I can't specifically answer if we've kind of thought about what's the most effective structure. But maybe it's a better conversation to have as you bring in the departments that will have more of that knowledge on how they administer the programs.
And going through here, there's a lot of food. There's SNAP, there's WIC, there's
There is.
school lunches, et cetera, there too. The opportunity, if it exists at all, for the subrecipients who have the best relationship with the family, or should have, as opposed to maybe no one does. Are there ways to consolidate's the wrong word, but anyways, to try to coordinate that in a way that you've got ABC's our main provider, and they're in the Acrimony household, and they can tell us when things are askew or they need a helping hand, et cetera, which is good. There's opportunities
Yeah.
sometimes.
Hey, Jim.
Obviously, this exercise can be actually very positive in a number of aspects. However, it can be very scary. And we hope for the best and prepare for the worst, I guess. But my question to you is, if we get significant reductions, and that's hopefully not going to happen, but if we do, are you asking departments to give us what you absolutely have to have, must have, or services of government versus nice to have that maybe, and I'll give you an example, and don't take this wrong. Last week, I heard Humanities lost a federal operating grant for 5 years. Okay, it's like 42% or something of their budget. It's going to be devastating to the humanities. I love some of the work that the humanities does. They bring speakers. We've had them in our historical society, all good. To me, and I'm just speaking for me, they may not be a must-have for government if it ever came down to that. So other people may have a different view on that, but are you asking your departments to prepare for that if there are significant, I don't know how you make up the Medicaid money. I really don't. I mean, even if you wanted to raise taxes, you can't.
There won't be enough.
There isn't enough capacity to do that. But aside from that,
So we do that every budget cycle in October when we meet with agencies and departments. And years ago, and you probably remember,
but you have stuff in your budget, just like we have in our budget, that arguably are nice to have, not must have.
and when we go through department budgets, we start with what revenues we have available. And then we start with what expenses we need to meet. And to the extent that there's a hole there, we ask departments to make reductions, to make choices. And at the end of the cycle, we have certain choices that are made, oftentimes none of which are good. But usually I would use the terminology, they're the least bad of the bad. And so that will come out, Jim, inevitably. To answer your question more directly, we haven't yet. We have not asked departments to start going through and telling us, what's nice to have and what they have to have, because we don't have enough information to know whether that's even an exercise we have to do. So, but come budget time, yes, absolutely. We will do that. And I'm frankly anticipating that this coming budget season, with or without loss in federal money, frankly, is going to be challenging based on our economic, our revenue forecast and our embedded base spending. So I'm sure that will be an added
I
pressure.
worry about that too, but
You too.
the committee knows that I'm a Debbie Downer sometimes. Trying to
Who,
take
you?
police place for last year.
I think what I would add to Commissioner Gresham's comments is, in some ways, there's still a long way to go to knowing what's actually going to be in the federal budget. With driving in the morning and hearing about where the, US Congress, the Senate is at versus the House, how are they going to reconcile those differences? And so we don't really know yet what the landscape will be. But that's why I think understanding where we are right now with our federal funds, assessing change as it becomes real and impacts us, but really working with the legislature to focus on our shared priorities, housing, affordability, public safety.
I mean,
Protecting the most vulnerable, for sure, but focusing on making sure we are operating state government as effectively as we can so that we're prepared for what may come next.
I mean, we can't dream up all the possible scenarios, and whatever we dream up, it'll be something else. So that's why it's so important for us to understand the complete lay of the land as much as we possibly can. And we'll all be thinking, I mean, I lie in bed in the morning and say, well, what if we lose all that? What are the core functions of government and who's going to be most harmed? And how can we be sure the fewest Vermonters are harmed as we go about all this stuff? So. And then we just have to be ready as we can be. Now, any other thoughts? So we will be getting agencies in and other state entities that are not agencies. So the treasurer is coming in. Tell you what's happening. Someone might have all that. Do folks have any more questions for?
If I may,
Secretary, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No
I
problem.
appreciate the balance between not wanting to increase anxiety needlessly against planning thoughtfully. And some of these things maybe we like to we use words like we should be transparent. Sometimes you want to hold things close to the vest, but saying to the director of Medicaid, what if we lose 10%? What would you do? What if we lose 20%? What would you do? Yeah, same thing. Without, you could pick DCF, you could pick Dale. That to me would some business office managers and deputies and you wouldn't have to take the whole workforce at a department and so they're losing sleep, which they may already be, but would be good information to have in your back pocket. And I guess you haven't started down that path yet, or you'd prefer not to go there.
Not specifically, but I think one of the things that you're gonna have a discussion about is the Medicaid program, right? Which is the largest program in state government. And they're already, and I think even as every year you have probably a Medicaid 101 in this committee, and we talk about discretionary and mandatory services. So I think getting everybody's brains wrapped around that in that one program, I think is valuable. I mean, this year, maybe you normally get an hour where you get a primer on the Medicaid program. I think digging into those details a little bit more will put the committee in a better place to understand as if there is change at the federal level. I'm not trying to be naive, but
Appreciate that.
When we're trying to educate ourselves. So we are going to have the Medicaid director, Monica Ogilvy, and Ashley Berliner, the director of Medicaid policy, in tomorrow morning at 9 to talk about it. We will have AHS back another time to talk about the specific spreadsheet and the budget and response to grants and that sort of thing. But this is also kind of a deeper dive into this piece that is such a huge part of the federal funding this state receives. So they're going to come in tomorrow at 9. At 10:30, the treasurer is going to be in to talk about cash flow and funding and what they're seeing. And Aaron's continuing to work. We are hoping to get Agency of Transportation in maybe by the end of the week because they've already done a lot of this work. And so that'll give time for the other agencies to get their pieces together and then they can start coming in next week. That's kind of what our plan is at this point. So any other thoughts or
Yeah,
happy
just
news you want to
on
share?
a personal note, I want to thank Sarah for playing in the March Madness competition. You're one of the few people that actually ended up below me.
What number were you, Jim?
15, but I wasn't 117.
Oh, that sounds pretty close. That's like around the
Well, you know what?
That's hard.
Representative Harrison, you've just given me all the fuel I need to enter next year, and I will start.
We'll be
the cash
studying
talking
it.
tomorrow. It's gonna be amazing. The phoenix rising from the ashes. Just narrowly beat you is really all that matters.
Yeah, and we have that here on camera.
Me too. May I just say that I am astounded that my performance was not highlighted anywhere in any of the emails, having risen like a phoenix from like 124 to number
Ended
11.
up at 11.
Really?
You're number one in our committee.
Yes.
Didn't say anything about appropriations team at all.
Oh, no.
Did you want to say something about
Appropriation beat Senate approach, and that's all that matters.
Yes, we came from behind. We were.
After they publicly asked her how House approach was
Yeah.
doing earlier in this.
I came to help them out on the
When
budget.
they were
and-
slightly ahead.
I have not gone back to mention
And
it.
forget about joint fiscal. I mean,
I did hear, Representative Harrison after he came out of the ceremonial office, yesterday, or no, today. That feels like yesterday already. Apparently the plan is that we'll be here for the World Series.
Oh, gosh.
Is that starting, doesn't it go to November now?
I know.
I think it's good. That's a little, okay, March Madness also happens in April. So thank you both very much for coming. I know we'll be having more
Yes,
conversations.
thank you both. Thank you.
Committee, we are going to meet tomorrow at 9 and talk about Medicaid and now